The first Prairie Fire Summit is happening in Regina today. It's part of the Native Prairie Restoration and Reclamation Workshop. The Canadian Prairie's Prescribed Fire Exchange will share how prescribed fires can help conserve grasslands and prevent wildfires. Renny Grillz is with that organization and the Meewasin Valley Authority's Resource Management Officer. Renny joins me now in studio to tell us more. Good morning, Renny.
Good morning, Adam.
So, Renny, for people that don't know, what is a prescribed fire?
Yeah, so prescribed fire is using fire as a land management tool to meet certain objectives. So whether it's reduce wildfire risk, to enhance grasslands for biodiversity, or to attract cattle into grazing into certain areas. But the difference between a controlled burn and a prescribed fire is the level of detailed planning that you use and meeting certain prescription weather conditions and management objectives, and the detailed planning on how to contain that fire to meet those objectives.
Why are prescribed fires important in our land here in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, so in Saskatchewan, our grasslands evolved under fire and grazing over the last 10,000 years. And so our grasslands are actually a fire-dependent ecosystem. And so to maintain that healthy ecosystem, we have to use grazing is really important, and the ranching industry is really important to keep these grasslands healthy. But once we remove fire from that system, we start seeing things like increased trees, increased shrubs, maybe more invasive species moving in. And then also we start seeing buildup of dead plant material, which actually starts increasing that fire risk to those grasslands.
Some people, when they think of a fire in a grassland or one of these areas, they're immediately going to go, "Oh, that's bad. What's happening there?" How do you educate the public about the importance of these for, as you're saying, replenishing the land, biodiversity, helping our ecology?
Yeah. So usually what happens when we have these big extreme wildfire events, it's usually under really hot conditions, windy conditions, high temperatures, and low relative humidity. And so that's where you have these catastrophic events. With the prescribed fire, what you do is you control the burning for when the conditions are more stable and it's more not as at high risk. And so it's sort of educating people and the public on the benefits of the fire, but also how you conduct the fire to reduce that risk overall.
Tell us about the summit. What's happening today?
Yeah, so this is our first Prairie Prescribed Fire Summit here in Saskatoon, in Regina, And what we're looking at is bringing people in from across Western Canada to talk about fire as a land management tool to maintain our healthy grasslands. We're bringing in a keynote speaker from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Dr. Dirac Tidwell, and his research looks at the invasion of trees into our grasslands and shifting these ecosystems from a grassland community to more of a forested community, and how fire can play a role in that. We also have speakers from different organizations across Western Canada talking about how they use fire as a land management tool. And then we're bringing in a panel this afternoon of different individuals that have started using fire. They've started taking training courses on prescribed fire, and they're taking fire back to their home organization and to use fire on their operations. So we have a community pasture manager from Aberdeen Municipal Pasture up northeast of Saskatoon. We got a volunteer fire department speaking as well. They started using fire as a way to reduce wildfire risk within their community. We also have someone from Nature Conservancy of Canada speaking, and also someone from Lakeland College in Alberta, where they're looking at building courses on prescribed fire.
When it comes to the land we have, and going through years where we have a drought or we have really dry conditions, how does that change what you do as far as land management goes? Yeah,
so like with any agricultural systems that you're managing, you manage within those drought conditions, right? So if you're in grazing management, you practice practices to conserve the amount of grass that you have and the amount of recovery. And it's the same thing with prescribed fire. You plan around those events, but you can meet different ecological objectives when you have those drier conditions or when you have those wetter conditions. And so you can use fire during those different conditions to meet different ecological objectives. So say in the drought conditions, if you're trying to control trees and shrubs, you might have your biggest impact for removal of trees and shrubs during these drier conditions.
When you talk about a sort of an invasion of trees, people might think, that sounds like a great thing. We want trees. Why are trees, a problem in this scenario?
Yeah, so a lot of people think, trees are really good. They're great for biodiversity. They're great for wildlife habitat. But when you think of our grasslands, quite often our open grasslands were wide open ecosystems with a few aspen stands and a few shrubs and community patches as well. What we're seeing is with this change in land management and also change in weather patterns, we're starting to see an increase in these trees and shrubs coming in. And so we actually start losing forage productivity. We're starting to lose habitat for grassland birds that use the open grass areas for nesting. And so we start seeing shifts in these ecosystems. And fire can play a role in trying to reduce some of this cover.
I mentioned you work with the Meewasin Valley, a beautiful area in Saskatoon. I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with it. How do you deal with this and sort of a changing climate and monitoring things year to year and looking at fire to management this?
Yeah, so with Meewasin, we've been using fire as a land management tool for over 30 years. And within the city limits and sites that we have outside the city limits in the River Valley. And we've built monitoring programs to see what the impact is of our prescribed fire programs, seeing if we're meeting these management objectives and seeing if we're causing any species shifts as well in, say, grass species or even those shrub species. And so we're monitoring those impacts. But also, sometimes we're burning for specific management objectives, like a specific species at risk or a grassland bird. Sometimes we're burning just to reduce fire risk along some of our trails so that if someone's walking by and a fire accidentally starts, it reduces that risk to the community as well.
How much of the discussion around wildfire risk or grass fire risk needs to be done with the public to try and educate them on when things are heightened? I know during the summertime when there's dry conditions, you'll hear maybe not burning in a campsite or things like that, or we shouldn't have backyard fires. How much more needs to be done as far as education about a good fire versus a bad fire with the public?
Yeah, and that's part of the role that we, with the Canadian Prairie's Prescribed Fire Exchange, is to start those discussions on the difference between good fire and bad fire, and how good fire can be used in a safe manner and under safe conditions to reduce the risk of that bad fire. And so, we're starting those conversations. We're, meeting with the public, meeting with landowners, meeting with producers, and having those discussions. However, under these, say, if we're under extreme dry conditions, quite often agencies will not burn because the risk is too high, right? So that's part of the planning process for prescribed fires is to reduce the overall risk, reduce the risk of any escapes, and we plan within those boxes to make sure if we have those extreme droughts or those extreme weather conditions, we shut down fire operations as well.
When is it common for the public to see these kinds of fire operations? Is there a season that's more common?
Yeah, so in Saskatoon, our typical fire season is sort of end of March through early April to beginning of May, and then again in the fall, sort of mid-September through to or first part of November is typically our burn programs. Most agencies are, trying to burn within those windows. Other parts of North America, they burn from February through to December. So it depends where you are in North America. For us here in Saskatchewan, most of it's early spring and then late fall.
I understand that you consulted with Indigenous groups when you go through some of these prescribed fires or discussing how to use the land. Why is that important?
Yeah, and it's with prescribed fire in a lot of Indigenous communities, they have been using fire for thousands of years as a land management tool, and it's helped shape their prairie grasslands. And the cultural use of fire is very significant in a lot of communities, and we've been having discussions with some of these communities to learn these stories, learn their practices, and have them share their stories with us, and that we can try and apply this to our individual organizations' prescribed fire programs. What's interesting is we're using Western science to conduct prescribed fires, but quite often those Western science techniques match up with those cultural practice techniques as well. And so, it's a long-term discussion. We're still having those discussions, and we're learning from each other as well. Agencies like Waskawan Heritage Park in Saskatoon, they've been using prescribed fire to meet management objectives around some of these sacred sites. So around medicine wheels, around bison rubbing stones, and they're working with elders to how is the best practice to do this safely to meet their cultural needs as well.
Renny, what's next with this effort, and what should people be looking for?
Yeah, so with the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, we're a network of people across all Western Canada, from Alberta to Manitoba, and we're working together to jointly work together to put safe fire on the landscape. And so our objectives are looking at training programs and education programs for agencies and landowners that are interested in prescribed fire. We're doing fire science work with a lot of researchers from different universities and research institutions to measure the impacts of prescribed fire and whether positive or negative impacts that we're having, and then also that overall education awareness with the general public. Also, as part of the fire exchange, we have equipment that we share amongst the partners as well, because when I started doing prescribed fire 30 years ago, the amount of equipment and personal protective equipment that we had was very limited. And now you were seeing this shift to more professionalism in prescribed fire, better equipment, better protective equipment as well, so we can do larger burns, safer burns more quickly.
Renny, thanks so much for your time and educating us about this. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam.